Mark chapter 7, verse 31. This is Jesus speaking, or this is talking about Jesus. Then he returned and went through this couple of regions to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. That means 10 cities. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged Jesus to lay a hand on this deaf man who also had a speech impediment. Now, verse 33. This is Jesus here. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he puts his fingers into his ears. Why would Jesus do that? I mean, when you meet people, that was a common greeting at the time. No, it wasn't. You don't put your fingers in people's ears as a common greeting. That's just, there's no way that we can explain that. But we know this person was deaf. What was he doing? Jesus was using sign language to try to communicate with this person. I know where your infirmity is. He's touching his ears, telling him, I know what's going on with you. He's using sign language to communicate with this deaf person. Now, it's not American Sign Language, right? But, because there's different versions, but at its basic rudimentary form, that's what he's doing. He put his fingers into his ears, and then after spitting, now that's another thing, you don't spit either. Spitting was a common thing of this day when you would go see magicians to get healed or tricks or something like that. Which leads to the question, why did he spit? He spit to communicate to this deaf person, you're used to this being associated with something miraculous. You're about to see something miraculous. Once again, as a form of communication with this person. And he does it again in the second one too. Let's continue reading verse 33. He took him aside from the crowd privately. He put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue. And then, looking up to heaven, Jesus looked up to heaven to let that deaf person know this isn't a magic trick done here on earth. This is different. This is going to be a healing, but it's going to be a healing coming from above, from the Lord, from the God of heaven. That's why he looked up to heaven. He sighed and he said an Aramaic word there, and then which means be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Healed of both things. Healed of his lack of hearing, and healed of his speech impediment. He spoke plainly, his tongue was released, and his ears were opened. And Jesus charged him, tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. He went and told everybody. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he's done all things well. That's the first miracle. That's the first. Jesus heals a person who's deaf. Now, go to chapter 8, verse 22. This is the third story. We're going to go to the first story, then the third story, then we're going to see how the second one in the middle puts it all together. These are incredibly short. 22, chapter 8, verse 22. Then they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. Sounds pretty similar to the deaf man, right? Except for this is blind. And he took the blind man by the hand. Similar situation there. Took the blind man by the hand to communicate with him, right? Took him by the hand and led him out of the village. Took him apart, just like the deaf person. And when he spit on his eyes, same thing. He laid his hands on him and asked, do you see anything? He looked up, I see people, but they look like trees walking. In other words, it was partially. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, don't even enter into a village. Basically sounds exactly like the healing of the deaf person, doesn't it? It's a similar situation. One person was deaf, one person was blind. Both times he takes them aside. Both times he does what he can to communicate to this person who has the sensory disabilities. Both times they're healed. Both times he says, don't tell anyone or just go home. Those are already similar. Now look what happens in between that. There's the story. This is the longest story here, but stick with me because this is all going to come together. And this is the Word of God right here. To me, this is exciting. Chapter 8, verse 1. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him and said to him, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. There's no McDonald's nearby. Their homes aren't nearby is what he's saying, right? We have to come up with food now. And his disciples answered them. This is what his disciples said to Jesus when Jesus said, everybody needs to eat. How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Now, if you've been with me on the journey through the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 6, it sounds eerily similar. Jesus fed a crowd of 5,000 there in a desolate place with bread and fish. This sounds identical, which leads to the question, is it the same story? Is it the same story that recorded twice? Is this an error in the Bible? No, it's not the same story at all. In fact, in Mark chapter 6, they were hungry for 1 day. This one, they're hungry for 3 days. Mark chapter 6, it's 5,000 people. Mark chapter 8, it's 4,000 people. Mark chapter 6, there was 12 remnants of bread taken up. In chapter 8, there's 7. There's a lot of differences. This is not the same feeding. So listen, if Jesus just fed people, just fed 5,000, not that, it doesn't, let's face it, just happened. Let's say it was 2 months ago. If you witnessed that kind of miracle, would you forget it in 2 months? No. If we were the disciples, I mean, it'd be easy to think, oh, people are hungry. No big deal. We got Jesus here. Watch this. But that's not their reaction. In fact, look at verse 4. And his disciples answered them. The ESV says, how can one feed? Your translation, whichever one you have, it might say, how can anyone? That's what it means. In the original language, which is Greek, the disciples are literally saying, nobody can feed anybody a crowd like this. Face palm. Do you not just remember what Jesus did before? If he can feed 5,000, he can feed 4,000, right? But what the disciples actually, how they respond to Jesus is, Jesus says, well, let's feed them. How can anyone feed a crowd like this in a desolate place? They're missing something. They're missing something. They're not putting things together. Verse 5 now, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, having given thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. Exactly what happened during the feeding of the 5,000 2 chapters ago. In other words, it's like Jesus is saying, oh, you don't remember? Make everyone sit down. He's doing the same thing to try to get them to remind them. Let me give you this bread. Here, you hand those out. Remember just like last time? And they set them before the crowd. Verse 7. And they also had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before him. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples. Now, this passage is not about, the main topic of this whole thing is not about the feeding. It's about the disciples' reaction. Because Jesus starts talking about the Pharisees, and the Pharisees began to argue with Jesus here. Look at verse 11. The Pharisees, that was a group of highly religious people, by the way. Highly religious. They were rule setters. They had all these rules, but their rules were far removed from God. The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. These Pharisees didn't believe Jesus was really the Messiah. Well, if you're the Messiah, then give us a sign from heaven. And Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them and got into the boat again. But you know what? Jesus was still thinking about the Pharisees when he was around his disciples, because look what happens in the next verse. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. Now they're without food again. And they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned the disciples, saying, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." That's not a common language that we use today. And that really wasn't a common language of that day. Jesus is using an analogy here. All right? The disciples don't pick up the reference. Verse 16, and they, referring to the disciples, began discussing the fact that with one another that they had no bread. Watch out for the leaven. He knows we're out of bread. Okay, what are we going to do about bread? He said something about bread. They're missing it. And Jesus, aware of this, verse 17, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread?" Now, these next few verses is at the heart of this entire passage here. Look. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Look at verse 18. Remember, Jesus just healed a deaf man. And right after this, he gives sight to a blind man, Mark records. Mark puts this, look what Jesus says. Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you see that correlation there? Do you see that correlation with both end cap stories? Mark is recording this on this way on purpose. He's writing this to teach us a lesson. Jesus is saying to his disciples, listen, you have ears but you don't hear. You have eyes but you don't see. Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you take up? They said 12. And then 7 of the 4,000. How many baskets of broken pieces do you take up? They said 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? That word, understand, is an interesting word also. It does not mean knowledge. There's a word for knowledge. It's gnosis in Greek. This is not the word knowledge. It's suneete. It means to learn, to comprehend. In other words, we can know. I know what the Saturn V rocket is. Now, how does it work? I have no clue. I can't comprehend it, but I know about it. Make sense? We can know all kinds of things and facts that we can't comprehend. Okay? There's 2 different things here. And Jesus also says it to them earlier in verse 17. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Same word. And then in verse 21, do you not yet understand? You have ears, but you can't hear. You have eyes, but you can't see. Interesting correlation. Some would say these 3 stories they're just unrelated events. However, it is not an accident when Mark writes this gospel, he puts them all in order like that. And he puts this right in the middle with Jesus, language from Jesus connecting them. You see, Jesus is concerned the disciples have all the knowledge of who he is, but lack the comprehension of the implications of his identity. In other words, catch this, they had knowledge, but they did not have education. What does that mean? Aren't those the same thing? Had one professor in Bible college, Dr. Jerry Goddard, had a doctorate of education. He's with the Lord now. If there's one thing I learned from him over and over and over in the classes, he would say this. Some people think knowledge is the same thing as education. Knowledge is not education. They are different. Knowledge deals with knowing facts. Education deals with changes. In other words, many people that have bad habits, they know they're bad habits, and they know what they're doing is not good for them, but they are not educated until they change it. Make sense? It's the difference between knowledge and education. Knowledge is knowing, just knowing the fact. Somebody who's into drugs knows drugs are not good for them, but they are not educated on it until they make a change in their life. You see, these disciples, and that's what it's talking about. These words for understand, it's not talking about knowledge. It's talking about education. It's talking about change. That's what it's talking about. This is the same word that Jesus has used over and over in Mark chapter 7, the chapter before this, verse 14. He called the people and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand." In other words, get these facts, get the knowledge, but then do something about it. Understand. Educate. Change. Same thing. Matthew 15:10, Jesus summoned the crowd. He told them, "Listen and understand." He's saying, listen to what I say and respond to what I say. Don't just have education, or don't just have knowledge, have education. That's what he's saying. Paul even uses this. He's talking about to the Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 4, he says, "But this is not the way you've learned Christ. Assuming you've heard about him, we have the knowledge, and were taught him as the truth is in Jesus." And then he says this, "Go ahead and put off your old self and put on your new self." Hang on, there's applying the knowledge. There's the education. There's the change. Do you see that? You see, there's a difference between knowledge and education. Knowledge is only facts. Knowing the facts. We can know. But Jesus is not interested to see who knows the most about him. Jesus is interested in people who are willing to change because of what they know about him. That's the purpose of this passage. Jesus is telling his disciples, listen, I know I can feed these people. I know but you haven't learned it. You're not educated. You haven't learned it. In other words, spiritual maturity is not about how much you know about Jesus. Spiritual maturity is how much you are changed because of Jesus. That's what the lesson he's teaching his disciples here. You know all the facts, having ears, having eyes. You've seen it all, you know it all. But you don't understand, you haven't learned the lesson, is what he's saying. You see, the Pharisees, that's why he says, beware of the lesson, or the leaven of the Pharisees. The Pharisees know who Jesus is. They've heard of his miracles. They've seen his miracles. They were present during Jesus' miracles, many of them. The Pharisees know all about Jesus, but the Pharisees are not willing to change based upon what they know about Jesus. There's a big disconnect there. And the warning that Jesus gives his disciples is he's saying, listen, there's too many people that focus on knowing facts about me and are not changing their lives because of me. That's what he's saying. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, when you study the Bible, particularly if you ever get a chance to do some really deep study in the original language, they always tell you, watch the imperatives. In fact, on the Bible study software I have, it automatically highlights all the imperatives. Now, for some of you, And in fact, I have to refresh myself on this a lot. What is an imperative? Any English teachers in here? An imperative conveys a command. It's a command. In all three of these stories, there's a couple of imperatives. The imperative is when Jesus says, be healed to the person, okay? But really, he's saying that to the sickness that he has. But the only imperatives given in this entire passage are actually in verse 15, when he cautioned them, saying, watch out, that's an imperative. Beware, that's an imperative. What is the action from all three of these stories? That's another reason we know all three of these stories go together. Because in all three of these stories, there's only one command that Jesus gives his disciples. Watch out. Be careful. Don't get caught up in knowing so much about Jesus that we do not apply to our life and be moldable and change who we are based upon our knowledge of Jesus. The Christian life is not a competition of fact collecting about Jesus. It's not what it's about. The Pharisees knew Jesus. Oh, they were collecting facts about Jesus. And they used a lot of that and distorted a lot of it to crucify him. It's not about fact collecting. Beware of gaining knowledge without education, is what he's saying. Without applying change. You see, to follow Jesus is to embrace an ever-changing lifestyle. When you follow Jesus, you are on a journey for the rest of your life to become more like Jesus. And if there is a season in our life where we are resistant to change and resistant to growing in the knowledge, and we are resistant, if we only want what we believe confirmed and not even challenged so we can ask God, God, where am I wrong? I know I'm not perfect. Am I the only not perfect one here today? I'm not perfect. I know there's things in my life that I need to change. We all do. And following Jesus is a life of pursuing change. Jesus is saying, don't just collect facts and not let them change you. Who I am, Jesus is saying, and my identity should change you always. You see, to follow Jesus is to embrace an ever-changing lifestyle. God does not need more people acquiring knowledge, but refusing to change anything in their hearts, in their lives, in their relationships, in their church life, whatever. On and on and on. God is looking for people today who will allow their knowledge of Jesus to change their lives. To change your life. That's who he's looking for today. You see, church life is not like a college or a university where the teachers are more respected because of their superior knowledge. No. Church life is not about knowledge. Church life is about being conformed into the image of Christ. God is still working on all of us. And may we be made more like Christ every time we meet. May we be ever-changing as individuals. So beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, of only knowing. Now this hits home. We have to ask ourselves a question. As a church, as Central Baptist Church, are we a knowledge church or are we a transformation church? Is Central Baptist Church a knowledge church? Are we focused on knowledge or are we focused on transformation? Teachers, if you teach an Equip Central class, is your class teaching for knowledge or are you teaching for transformation? In our country today, there are more unbelievers than ever who desperately need knowledge of Jesus. I've talked to people before. Have you ever heard of John 3:16? They see the sign at football games and stuff, but they have no clue that it's even a Bible reference. They've never heard of John 3:16. I've talked to people that, well, you know Adam, the first person, right? Who? People don't know who Adam is. You can't use the story of Adam and Eve to demonstrate sin because they've never heard of Adam and Eve. It's unbelievable. So this is not saying, Jesus is not saying that one is bad and the other is good. No. You need both. You need the knowledge of Him and the education and the willingness to change and grow because of who Jesus is. The world today needs both. There are people in Marion, Ohio, and in Caledonia, and in Big Island, and in Prospect, and you name it. Maybe even in your workplace. Maybe even in your home. Maybe even in Central Baptist Church this morning, who need to know about Jesus. But I also know this. There's not a lot of people who need to know about Jesus, yes. But, especially the state of Christianity in this country, in this state, in this city, in all over, there are too many that have the knowledge of Jesus, but not the education, not the life change. Not the life change. There are churches all over filled with knowledge, but lack the transformation in their congregation. The disciples knew Jesus fed the 5,000. I mean, there's no way that we can actually say, it looks like they forgot. No, you don't forget something like that. In fact, that's why Jesus is a little bit frustrated with them. He says, how is it that you don't understand? Like, you were there. You're the ones that distributed the loaves for the 5,000. They know, but they have not learned. Boy, is this like us today? Is it like us? Jesus is asking the disciples, basically he's saying, why are you guys worried about bread when you already know I'm going to take care of you? Do we ever worry about what we know God has already taken care of? You know it. Now count on it. Do you count on Jesus to do what you already believe He'll do? That's faith. It's counting on God to do what you already know He'll do. Maybe there's somebody here who has the knowledge of Jesus, who's been to church many times, who has people in their life that know Jesus, who knows that, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, that He's death, burial, and resurrection, that He's the only one that's ever resurrected, that He lived a perfect life, that Jesus Christ is sinless. There may be somebody here that knows who Jesus is, but have refused to accept Jesus as their Savior and therefore resisted the wonderful change that Jesus Christ can bring about in their life. Is that you this morning? Is there something in your life that you know you should change? And will you trust God for that change? Will you commit that to Him today? Saving faith in Jesus Christ does not come just with knowledge about Jesus. Saving faith in Jesus Christ comes by the education, by the knowledge plus being willing to change. Saying, Jesus, change my life. Jesus, forgive my sin. Because of who you are, Jesus, I know you can forgive my sin and change my entire eternity. You see, it's not until you trust Jesus for change that you can really be saved. Otherwise, you can hear lesson after lesson and sermon after sermon and learn more about the identity and person of Jesus Christ. But it's not until we trust him for change that he'll bring it and that he'll forgive your sin. So if you're here and you know Jesus as your Savior, is there something in your life that you know should change? If so, would you trust God for that change? And will you commit that to him today? If you're here and you do not know Jesus as your Savior, can I encourage you, don't settle for just knowledge about Jesus. Don't settle for knowledge. Don't settle for knowledge. There's a different passage in the New Testament that says, on the day of judgment, it's appointed a man once to die, and after this the judgment. And on that day of judgment, there's going to be many standing before Jesus. Lord, I know who you are. Did I not prophesy in your name? I've told other people about you. Of course I can go to heaven. I'm a member of Central Baptist Church. Of course I go to heaven. I know who Jesus is. I know all about him. I've sat in classes. I've studied the Bible. I know about Jesus. And God's going to say, depart from me. I never knew you. Because maybe we know, but we must also be willing to trust God for the change in our lives.